Right behind me, connecting these two buildings together, is what's called the Skyway Bridge Connector. It's a structure that's used to connect two buildings to one another. Basically a huge hallway where if you're over here, you want to go over there. If you're over there, you want to come over here, then you take the connector. It connects two buildings together. I like to think of this connector as an architectural conjunction. Do you remember learning about conjunctions in grammar? They were the short little words that combine two ideas together that bring a sentence together. A conjunction can totally mess with the meaning of a sentence. So as I studied the different one-at-a-time stories in the Gospels, I discovered that there was a common conjunction in these stories. And this conjunction joined two things together and made all the difference. So I'm gonna come back to that in a minute. Before I do, let me just start by asking you a personal question. If you had to narrow it down to one emotion, what would you say is your primary emotion? I mean, if you do the research on this, depending on who you listen to, there are anywhere from 6 to 34,000 different emotions a human can experience. And you probably don't need that whole list to narrow down how you feel most of the time. If you're not sure about your primary emotion and you ask a few of the people you do life with and they come back hesitant to answer your question, then probably, irritable and temperamental might be the diagnosis. But it got me thinking, what was the most common emotion that Jesus felt? Like in the Gospels, we see that Jesus felt a lot of different emotions. He experienced exhaustion and joy and anger, frustration, disgust. He experienced grief and loneliness and rejection and dread. But the most common emotion that is attributed to Jesus is a little bit surprising. It's compassion. Compassion. What's interesting about that is that most of our emotions tend to be very much self-centered, right? Like I tend to base my feelings on what I'm going through in a certain moment. But the primary emotion of Jesus was determined by what others were experiencing, what others were going through. That's compassion. For a long time, I thought of myself as a compassionate person. I thought of myself as compassionate because if I see someone in pain, I feel for them. I hurt for them. But compassion is more than that. It's more than just a feeling of empathy. And as I trace the times Jesus had compassion in the Gospels, I noticed a conjunction. I noticed this word that joined together his feeling with a story. It's not that Jesus just had compassion, period. It's that Jesus had compassion and that in one building is all of this emotion, how you feel. But the word and connects his emotion to action. So some examples of this. Matthew 20, verse 34. Jesus had compassion on two blind men and he touched their eyes. Mark chapter 1, verse 40, Jesus had compassion on the leper and healed him. Mark chapter 6, verse 34, Jesus had compassion on the people and began feeding them. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, Jesus had compassion on the people and he prayed for them. When Jesus felt compassion, it was followed by action, and it always created a story. And so the life of Jesus makes it clear that compassion isn't just an emotion. It's not just living in that building of feeling sorry for someone. The one-at-a-time life of Jesus shows us that compassion gets connected to what we do about it. It would define compassion this way: a strong emotion that elicits a physical response, that the test of compassion is in the conjunction. Is there an and? The word and is the connector that a lot of us, I think, are missing in our one-at-a-time stories. Like we get stuck in that building of emotion, but we never really do much about it. In the building of emotion, we feel compassionate. We feel empathy, but what's often missing is an and. We need an and to join our emotions and our action. It's not enough just to feel something. We need to cross over through the hallway and do something. Over the years, I've taken my son on a number of snow skiing trips. We usually head to Colorado for a few days and hit the slopes. And I often feel compassion when I'm skiing through the Colorado Rockies because people are constantly wiping out, taking hard falls. The last time we went to Colorado, we got on the lift and we headed towards the top of the mountain. And my teenage son, who at that point was already a much better skier than me, he listened to my lecture about not going too fast, skiing within his limits. And I knew how the day would go, right? Like he would speed down the mountain, wait for me at the bottom, and then we'd take a lift back up together. But on the very first run, my son quickly disappeared out of sight. I'm skiing side to side, making my way down, and about halfway down the mountain, I noticed someone to my left who had taken a hard fall. His skis and poles were all over the place, and immediately I felt compassion, like, poor guy, like that's a rough way to start the day. The skier was completely laid out. I could hear him moaning, and I hated it for him, I really did. But, what was I gonna do? But then suddenly I realized that skier was my son. And I rushed over to him. He was hurt, he was in a lot of pain, he had broken his clavicle, and my response in that moment is the difference between the feeling of compassion and doing something. When the wiped out skier went from being some bro on the slopes to being my one and only son, it changed everything. I didn't just feel bad for him, I hurt for him. My strong emotion elicited a physical response. I didn't just feel sorry for him, I stopped what I was doing to help him. It was a zoom lens moment. I was gonna do whatever was necessary to help him, and no one was gonna get in my way. And Jesus demonstrated that kind of compassion because, listen, every hurting person was a son or a daughter. So if compassion is the fuel for living a one-at-a-time life, then I think the question we want to ask is, how do we grow in that? How do we grow in compassion? Well, in Luke 7, we read about Jesus meeting a woman whose son had died. She was already a widow, her husband had already passed, and now she was on her way to bury her only son. Luke 7 says, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, don't cry. I want you to notice the order of things here in this one-at-a-time story. First, Jesus saw her. Second, his heart went out to her. And then we find that there is this connection, a connection between his eyes and his heart, and then between his heart and his hands, that he did something. Luke 7 says he went up and he touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still, and Jesus said, young man, I say to you, get up. And the dead man sat up and began to talk. I wish I knew what he said. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. And so it's this crazy moment. Jesus is crossing all kinds of social boundaries that people back then never crossed. There was a law that said you couldn't touch a dead body or touch anything that had touched a dead body, otherwise you would be considered unclean. And Jesus, he touches this boy, and I can imagine the crowd gasped, but the crowd wasn't the only one. The boy gasped as he came back to life. And so notice the one-at-a-time pattern. Jesus sees, Jesus feels, Jesus acts. But the test of compassion is in the action. Because I think oftentimes we see, oftentimes we feel, but we don't ever take the hallway. We don't ever do anything. We end up using the wrong conjunction. Instead of our stories being, I had compassion, and our stories become, I had compassion, but there was nothing I could do. I had compassion, but I thought somebody else would do something. I had compassion, but my calendar was already full. I had compassion, but it's not a good time. I'll have to come back later. I had compassion, but I don't think I can make a difference. I don't think I have the right resources. It's not my problem. I should just mind my own business. Instead of I had compassion and it's I had compassion, but Jesus shows us a different way. He had no earthly connection to this widow or to her son. He technically didn't know any of the people. Jesus wasn't asked to get involved,
but he felt compassion. And when Jesus felt compassion, there was always an and. A while back, I was in the checkout line at Walmart. Typically, I stand in the checkout line and just think about what other line I should have picked because it's moving faster. But I have been trying to live life with a more intentional zoom lens, and I noticed a young lady in front of me who was holding a baby. And I didn't know her name, but I prayed for her. I said, God, I know this young mom is your daughter. I know you love her. Please let her know you love her today. If there's anything you want me to do for your daughter, then please let me know. And as the cashier was ringing up her items, I overheard her tell the cashier to stop. Like that was her limit. She didn't have money to cover more. In fact, she asked the cashier to take a few items off so she would have enough money. And I didn't want her to feel embarrassed, so I took a step back. I looked at the candy and the gift card aisle. I said another prayer for her. God, would you please provide for her today? Would you please let someone who knows about her situation do something to help this young mom? So yeah, I can clearly be a little slow, but then all of a sudden it hit me, like I know about the situation. I could reach out and I could help, and I was literally staring straight at gift cards. And so I quickly bought one and I hustled out to the parking lot and handed it to her. She was putting her groceries in the car. And as I walked back towards my car, I wish I could say it just felt really good, but it really felt really convicting. Because I just realized how often there should have been an and there wasn't. How oftentimes there should have been a story, but I got stuck in the building of just feeling empathy. One at a time stories don't happen on this side. One at a time stories require you to join your feelings together with your action. Real compassion doesn't just break your heart, it moves your muscles. The test of compassion isn't the feelings you have, but the one at a time stories you can tell. Living a one at a time life, living that kind of impact and influence with your life means that you're always looking for an and.